Hour for discussion. Um, so, Esther and the Queen You Never Knew, review and applications. So, if you weren't here, this will give you a understanding of what you missed, hopefully, or at least a broad overview of what you missed. And you should know that the University Church of Christ Denver YouTube sermons channel, I think that's right, has these classes on it, and there are 10 of them. They're all about an hour long, and unfortunately, class number 6, the mic wasn't charged, and so don't try and figure out how you can get sound, because you can't. And but other than that, I listened to all of them in preparation for this class, and no hubris intended, but they're pretty good. They are pretty good. So
So the classes you taught, are they separate? Like, are they like, I haven't been here, so are they?
They are this class.
Yeah.
They are the ones that I taught. They are my slides, and there was one. That was a good question, and there was one other thing I wanted to say about that, but I can't remember what it is. So yeah, lots of interesting and new stuff that I have never heard taught before in a class on Esther. So the first class, we went through the objectives, and my objective was really to teach the class of Esther as a within its historical context. I also said that it was not my intention to try and somehow reveal God to you or make you closer to God. It was really an effort to try and help you develop your own rubric about who God is and how to make some present day applications. I went through the sources and the preparation materials that I read for this. We went through the good Jewish attitudes towards the book of Esther and the bad Christian attitudes. I want to highlight some of those because if you remember, we talked about this this Christian theologian and author, scholar, who wrote to the Queen in what's modern day France, and Germany. I can't remember what his name was at this point, but he wrote what's called a gloss, which was in the medieval times. It was we'll call it a side column reference, and it was notes that helped you understand the book. The book of Esther has always been received negatively by Christian scholars almost throughout until the modern era, and you still find very little about it for the first, I want to say, 700 years of Christianity. There was never any kind of reference to the book of Esther. Martin Luther didn't feel like it needed to be part of the canon. People thought that it was too violent, that it was inconsistent with Jesus, all the killing that the Jews did. And the only way they could make sense of it was to interpret it as an allegory. And so everywhere you saw king, you replaced it with the name Jesus. Everywhere that you saw enemy of God's people or the Jews actually became the enemy. And for 500 years, that gloss was in every Bible that you read. And so all Christians saw that were reading the Bible, and it went on for 500 years. And I think another thing that we talked about was how Hitler used the book of Esther to justify his persecution of the Jews and to propagate that throughout the common public. We also talked about how, aside from the Torah, the first 5 books of the law, the Jews feel like Esther is one of the most important books in the Old Testament. the Tanakh, as they call it, not the Old Testament. They don't have an Old Testament. So, well, we reviewed that. Then we also talked about Eastern and Western approaches to Scripture, and we talked about how we superimpose our understanding of how things need to be read and done, and it comes from our culture. History was very different from an Eastern culture. History was less about facts and figures and dates and accuracy, and more about a Near Eastern perspective. Is if this is inspired writing, what I want to do, if I'm going to take the time to actually write something down, I want there to be reality to it, but the real goal is to change the reader. And so history is very different from an Eastern perspective versus our current Greek influenced Western perspective. We also talked about Western ideas of sin and God and who God was and how we learn. Um, we also, in the introductory material, talked about fact or fiction. Is this book a book of fiction? Is this a book of fact? Um, it, Either way, it doesn't change the fact that it's inspired. And we, in our Western culture, oftentimes want to read anything that is not poetry as history. And we, again, superimpose a Western perspective of what history is supposed to be. And we have seen our own culture create divisions amongst our people. Was the world created in 7 days? It says there were seven, there was another day. And so, and are we going to fight about it? And will I accept you into my fellowship? Because this is history. And history has to be accurate and it has to be. So that is a very, but could it be inspired and not be 7 days? Could it be inspired and not have happened? Could there be something, could it be a teachable moment between the divine and humanity? We had a lot of conversation about that. I gave a lot of evidence for why it is factual. I gave a lot of evidence for why it is not factual.
Esther.
The book of Esther. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, no, we did not cover creation. I was just using that as an example. We also used the idea that there are 14 flood stories, or at least 7, and how they do we litigate that, or do we try and learn something from what we have um, in our sacred writings? We also talked about critical thinking. I showed the picture of the World War II aircraft that had all kinds of bullet holes in it, and um, how the war analysis decided to change the design of the planes, and how it was really incorrect, and it comes from what they call survival bias, which is we make decisions on what we have, but we don't oftentimes we forget that we don't have everything, and what is missing in the archaeological record, what is missing in the ancient writings that we don't have, and if we only use what we have, are we missing something? Which gives us a certain amount of freedom, right, to rethink how things happen. In class 2B, because I didn't finish the class, so I had to have a second class. We talked about the background of the audience. We talked about how this was a writing from the exilic period. In the exilic period, you had a group of people who had been told they were God's chosen. For hundreds of years, they had been taken into captivity by 3 different empires: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and in Esther, the Persians. And what was the main question for those people at that time? Their temple had been destroyed. And Brad, you don't get to answer. Sorry. But what was the main question amongst God's people, amongst the Jews, during that period of their history?
Are we still a people?
Thank you. They're definitely a people. Are we still
God's people?
God's people? Are we still chosen? God has punished us. He's taken us into captivity. We're being punished. Are we still his people? Does he still love us? Is he still going to use us? This was a huge question and has to be considered in any writing that was done during that period. We talked about hidden transcripts and Brer Rabbit, and as an example. and how hidden transcripts are a survival tool that people who are oppressed, people who are on the underside of domination, people who are not in the majority, people who are slaves, people who have no rights, like people who have taken into exile, people who are in captivity, the way the Jews were. Oftentimes, they use what's called hidden text to survive and to make sense of their own life. We talked about how the literary style of the book is one of comedy and humor. It's akin to in many ways to Shakespeare's comedy of errors, and how there are so many things that are turned upside down in the Book of Esther. There are so many motifs within the Book of Esther that fit into this category of comedy. We talked about what comedy is and why people laugh, and how it becomes a method of therapy, and how it is a tool of survival. We also talked about how it seems to be the book itself seems to be an invitation to play, and how Jews have heard that call, and how they have used that, and how they have in their commentaries, in their midrash, in their writings about the Book of Esther, they accept that invitation to play, and they embellish it even more and more, and they as a consequence oftentimes put a fine point on how ridiculous some of the things that are written in the Book of Esther really are, and how that again was a tool of survival. In the third class, which was really the fourth class, we dealt a little bit more with the literary style, and in particular, we talked about how it's a very unique book in its style, because the book is written with a very arm's length approach, but it's written brilliantly in that it uses that approach. It has a narrator. It doesn't mention the word God. It doesn't have Jewish cultural behavior like dietary laws and all the things that would make someone Jewish are not shown there. It's just a narrator observing the scenes until we get, and then the narrator or the author uses that style to draw you in and to build the tension. And part of the way that it draws you in is you start to hear the voices and thoughts of the main characters. And at that point, you get drawn into the book a whole lot more than when the narrator is just telling you about it from a 30,000 foot view. We also talked about some good questions. By class number 4, I had hoped that everyone had read all of the 10 chapters of Esther. And so I proposed some of these questions myself. Even though it goes is numbered from 1 to 12, there are 13 questions there, but that's just par for the course. And we'll go through these very quickly. Why does the book seem to keep going even after the story is done with the last 2 chapters? Why would you call the holiday at the end of it Purim, given the fact that the poor were, P-U-R, were used as lots to kill them? We talked about how we wouldn't name a day when we were supposed to be exterminated by AK-47 rifles. We wouldn't call it AK-47 Day. Nobody in their right mind would come up with that. So why are they calling this Purim, celebrating the tool of their demise? Why does it seem to celebrate Mordecai's rise to power? And it looks like his name is misspelled there. Sorry. Why does the book open with the grandeur of the Persian king? I thought it was a book about Judaism and part of the Jewish canon. Why does Esther cry when she cries? She doesn't seem to cry when she goes to the king the first time. When it tells us that she could have her head chopped off. She cries after Haman has been killed. And she goes to talk to the king. Why does Esther wait twice to make her request to the king? She seems to test his patience in a very, very dangerous way. Why does Mordecai talk of the destruction of Esther and her father's house? She is, after all, an orphan. Why did Mordecai write to destroy, kill, annihilate the armed men and their women and their children and plunder their property? We talked about how this was a big part of why Christian scholars oftentimes reject this book. Why did the Jews not take the plunder of their enemies even after there was an edict? um, telling them that they could. Why did Esther hide her identity? Um, and then we talked about Haman's complaint to the king and his plot to kill the Jews. He seems to make 3 complaints, and yet really only one of them seems to really matter, which is they disobey the law. Why would the king demand the queen's beauty be put on display for other men? This is interesting. I was thinking about it this morning, and I thought we so often assume that that it was the king's fault, that this was the king's error. He was doing something inappropriate because he was drunk. But I've never heard anyone say, maybe actually it was Vashti. Maybe it was Vashti's issue. But we talked about that in class, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we review. Class number 4, we actually got into talked a little bit about the historical context, as in real history. We talked about the start of the Persian Empire after the Babylonian Empire. King Darius, or Darius the Great, who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. His son Xerxes, the conquest of Greece. We talked about the Battle of Thermopylae and the movie 300. We talked about Xerxes burning Athens to the ground. We talked about other world events that were going on at the same time. Pythagoras, Confucius, Persepolis, Sophocles, Herodotus, Thucydides, the historian who wrote the Peloponnesian Wars, Socrates, and we talked about the first race after the Battle of Marathon. And all of those things were going on contemporary to what's going on in Esther. And we talked about how all of these people, history, politics and democracy in Greece, theater and art, sports, all of these things were happening, philosophy, religion, mathematics, many great founders of those fields existed at the same time. And somewhere in the backwater, in Susa, God was working, and how God doesn't necessarily follow the same pomp and circumstance that we have celebrated throughout time. We also talked about the opening scene, and in that we answered these 2 questions. Why does the book open with the grandeur of the Persian king? And why would the king demand the queen's beauty be put on display for other men? In particular, it opens in year 3. Most historians and biblical scholars believe that this was that King Ahasuerus, as it is written in the original text, was King Xerxes. In year 3 of his reign, he had just taken the throne. For the first 3 years, he was in battle, putting down. Tell us what he was doing, Brad.
Putting down rebellions.
In Egypt and Babylon. So at this point, he comes together for a 6-month festival. At year 3, all of his military leaders are there. All of the provincial governors are there. He's consolidating his kingdom. He's trying to bring unity. And we talked about perhaps that's the reason it opens, is because it actually was a historical fact. We also talked about why he wanted, why would he put his queen's beauty on display before other men? And I posited that he was looking for a Lady Liberty. He was looking for a Lady Columbia. He was looking for a personification of his 127 province empire that people could look to because of the wealth, because of the splendor, because of his leadership, because of the beauty of his wife, because of everything that she was. He was looking for Miss Persia. And perhaps Vashti didn't want to come because she was Egyptian. Perhaps she didn't want to come because she was Babylonian. Perhaps she didn't want to come and parade in front of these people because those people who were rebelling that just got killed. I'm not saying it happened. We don't have it. The text doesn't say that. but perhaps that's the reason she didn't come. And I promised during that class to give evidence that that was probably the case as we went on through the text. In class number 5, we talked about the Miss Persia pageant and hidden identities and the plot against Xerxes. We answered the question there, 10.5, why did she hide her identity? And we talked about how hidden identity is not as simple as the rubric, honesty is the best policy. Oftentimes we think that there are these behaviors that become foundational truths. And within the context of an oppressed people, passing and performing can be, and hiding can be about survival. And I would suggest that most women understand this very, very clearly, because oftentimes they are passing, they are performing, and they are doing things that that allow them to survive in a male-dominated world. And that's the best analogy I can come to, because I've never been a slave and I've never been a piece of property, and I really can't relate to that. But we do see a lot of hiding in our society today. People hide their identity, and it's not always as simple as they're being dishonest or they're cowards. We talked about that in class number 6. We talked about Haman's rise to power, Mordecai's offense, how he cast lots every day to determine when he was going to kill all the Jews. He wrote an edict to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews. And then we talked about Mordecai's grief and Esther seeming to shift in her stance and who she was. We answered the question why he made 3 complaints against the Jews, and only one of them seemed to matter. But it turns out that Haman really just wanted to kill Mordecai, right? I mean, he was just upset because he had an outside, he had a too big of an ego, couldn't get over himself, but he felt like that was petty. So he was smart enough to know that I can't just kill this one guy because I don't like him. He won't bow down to me. And so he came up with this scheme to kill all of the Jews. And the scheme was to make them into an existential threat to the kingdom, right? He says that they have different customs, that they're scattered throughout the land, and that they don't obey. And really, if you look at it and think about it, he basically was saying, we've got this refugee problem, and certain refugees are not playing according to the rules. And if we don't get rid of them, they pose an existential threat to this kingdom. And so we need to wipe them all out. And that is the argument that he makes to the king. And that's why he uses all 3 of those. We also, in the blue there, we postponed the 2 questions that came up in the text about Mordecai and the way that he minimizes his role with Esther. Mordecai finds out that the entire Jewish population is at risk, is being threatened, and he comes to the queen, and he doesn't say, we're desperate, we need you, you have to stand up. He says, you're not really that important, but you do have an opportunity. He says, if you don't speak up, God will find another way. So it's okay. I mean, it's not the way I would have approached the situation. We played some games there. What if you were Mordecai? I would be saying, please, 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 you must. You are so important. You are our only hope. But what Mordecai says is, if you don't. But then he also says something weird, which is, if you don't, there will be consequences. You and your father's family will be wiped out. But we talked about how strange that was. From this is not persuasive to Esther because she's an orphan. So why is that supposed to be motivating to her? We postponed those until a later date when we talked about them. In class number 7, I didn't make it, but I think I can make it in a short order here. In class number 7, Esther goes to the king. She goes twice. She throws 2 drinking parties. The literal translation is drinking parties, not banquets. Haman throws a hissy fit because Mordecai won't bow down to him. Xerxes, for whatever reason, can't sleep. Haman stops by in the middle of the night. Haman honors Mordecai. And then there's the big reveal during the second drinking party. then Xerxes needs a little space, and Haman goes bye-bye for the rest of the story. We answered the question, why does Esther wait twice to make her request to the king? We talked about how strange it was that Esther goes through this sense that I could get my head chopped off if I go to the king. She gets past that. He lowers his scepter. He listens to her. He knows she's troubled. He asks her what's wrong. She says, would you come to this party and have a drink with me and Haman? And the king says, I'll give you up to half of the kingdom. He says it 3 times. He offers it to her. But we talked about how that was a little weird because his patience could be running out. Like, I offered you half the kingdom when you came to my throne. I offered you half the kingdom when we got together for a drink with Haman. Is he going to do it again? And yet Esther takes that risk and says, I think I've got the king. But maybe she was playing another game, because the first time there seems to be an error of pronouns. I mean, we think we're the first generation to think about how important pronouns are. Because we don't always catch this in the text because English translations oftentimes correct the error. But what Esther says in the text is, will you come to a banquet? Will you come and have a drink with me and Haman for the banquet that I've prepared for him? Right? And it's left hanging. Like, who's the him of those 2 people that she's inviting to this banquet? And then the second time she says, will you come to a second banquet that I've prepared for them? And it seems to put and again, the king knows that his wife is troubled. The king loves his wife and is willing to give up to half the kingdom. It just puts a seed of doubt in his mind. Is there some adultery going on between my wife and this chap Haman, the second in command? And that is borne out in that as soon as Esther accuses Haman, and Haman is pleading for his life in the absence of the king, and the king comes back in and sees Haman on his knees, falling onto the couch of the queen, he jumps to the conclusion that Haman is assaulting his wife. That doesn't make sense. The queen has just accused Haman of trying to take over the empire and kill his wife. Why would the king jump to the conclusion that they're carrying on if that seed hadn't been planted? In class number 8, I made some final notes on Haman, the fact that all of his household and his property were turned over to Esther and Mordecai. We talked about how Esther now has to make a second approach, and it's just like the first one where the scepter has to come down. She's coming before the throne. She's risking her life. They don't go into all of that because we've already seen it in the story. But what is a little interesting, Haman has been executed, but on the second approach, she comes with tears. And she comes with tears because she has to plead for her people. And she says her people and her kindred. And this is the evidence that perhaps the king was looking for Miss Persia. Because at this point, what Esther is saying is, I have a loyalty that's greater than my loyalty to Persia. I have a loyalty to the Jewish people. And that brings her to tears, and that brings her to begging. And she has to be asking herself, how much at risk am I? And will the king do to me what he did to Vashti, when Vashti expressed that she had a greater loyalty to her people maybe than she did to. Yeah. So during this class, we answered some questions this kills, her. This ends up with Haman dead. As I said, he went bye bye, but it doesn't end the problem, and that's why we need the last two chapters. We talked about why Esther cried when she did, and when she didn't, and then we see Mordecai's edict. And Mordecai wrote this edict that you're supposed to kill, annihilate the men, women, and children, and take their property, and why that seemed so harsh. But at this point, we have an edict coming from Haman saying that the people who should rise up against the Jews, and they should they should destroy, kill, and annihilate their men, women, and children, and take their property as plunder. And so 3 months later, we have Mordecai writing an edict, and he has to write the exact same words. Because if you were a governor or a leader, a military leader in this kingdom, how would you determine which side of this civil war are you going to be on? You're trying to understand, where does the king really fit in this process? Is the king siding with the Jews, or is the king siding with the people who are killing the Jews? And so the wording is exactly the same in both edicts, and it's there to try and give the Jews a chance, and try and create an illusion that the king may in fact be on the side of the Jews. In class number 9, we talked about coincidence and providence. We talked about I won't go there. We talked about how there was no plunder taken. We talked about a mystery reference from Mordecai and the name Purim. We answered these questions. Why is it called Purim? We answered those two questions that we had put off in a previous.
Why is it called Purim?
And we answered the question, why the Jews didn't take the plunder of the enemies. I wish I would have put these questions in a more logical order. I didn't. I wrote them down randomly as I was preparing the class, and that's the way they stayed throughout the class. But the Jews didn't take the plunder because this was a battle between the Amalekites and Agag and Saul. Right, we know that Mordecai was a direct descendant of Saul. We know that Haman was a direct descendant of Agag, and that was the battle that ultimately lost Saul his kingdom. The kingdom was torn away from him as a consequence of leaving them alive, but they were ordered not to take the plunder some 1,000 years earlier, and they remembered that and did not take the plunder, even though they were given permission to do so. The funny reference from Mordecai as it relates to minimizing her role and the destruction of her father's house came out of the book of Numbers. It was the law of young women as they take a vow, and as they take a vow, if their husband hears about it, the husband needs to speak within the day he hears about it in order to nullify the vow. Otherwise, he is guilty. He and his household are guilty of the rash vow that had been taken, and he would be punished for it. He and his father's household. In the same way, the Mordecai is answering Esther, and he is calling back to that passage in Numbers. And it turns out that if you take and change the vowelization, and we talked about this, of one word in that quote, the phrase the end of that chapter 30 of Numbers ends that a husband or a man can confirm, or a husband can annul. It's talking about a vow. And if you change the vowelization of the word, I think it's a husband, isn't it? It means a woman. And so a woman can confirm, a woman can annul. And so really what Mordecai was saying is, you have the power as the spouse of the one who has taken a rash vow, the edict. you have the power to annul that. A woman can confirm or a woman can annul. If she confirms through silence, she is guilty, and she and her father's household will be punished. If she annuls, it will be fixed. But it turns out that in Hebrew, this word, and I can't remember it right now, but it's pur, Phur. And in ancient Persian, and what's the other language that the Old Testament is written in? The word pur, Pur, is the word for lots. And so one is the Persian language means lots, and Hebrew, it means annul. And so essentially, and if you read in this class, we looked at why, because it says there are two reasons why we call it Purim. One is because of the lots, and the other is because of the edict, the words that were written. She annulled the vow. And so those were, that's why it's called Purim, to answer your question as I put you off before. In class number 10, we talked about repaying a 1,000-year-old debt. We talked about the parallel passage that is alluded to by three quotes that come out of the book of Esther that are direct quotes out of the book of Genesis and the story of Jacob and Joseph and Judah and Benjamin. And so I got that name in. There you go. And the fact that Judah, who had a very, let's say, less than harmonious relationship with his two brothers, Joseph and Judah, or Joseph and Benjamin, because they were born of Rachel, and they were loved more by Jacob. But at the end of the story, when he was before Joseph, and Joseph had set Benjamin up as a thief, and was telling Judah that Benjamin had to stay and be his personal slave, Judah begged for Benjamin's life and said, "Take me instead." And essentially, the parallel there is that the family of God, and in particular, the family of God was at stake, was at risk of being exterminated through the famine, and ultimately Benjamin and the whole tribe was being threatened by this foreign king in Egypt, or this foreign ruler in Egypt named Joseph. And Judah was willing, for the sake of Jacob's love for Rachel and Jacob's love for Benjamin, he put his life on the line, and that debt was never repaid. And in fact, it was repaid by Esther, who was a Benjamite, who went before a foreign king and begged for the life of her people, who at that point, the only tribe known besides the Benjamites were the Judites, which were, and we talked about that as well. So she essentially was coming and saying, please spare the tribe of Judah. The other 10 tribes besides Benjamin and Judah are known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, right? Because they were scattered throughout Assyria and Babylon, and really weren't allowed to live together as a community during their exile. So, yeah, I guess we answered that Mordecai's rise to power was really about celebrating the harmony that he as a Benjamite brought, and the effort to bring about harmony with God's people that originated from the story in Genesis between Rebecca and, thank you, Hannah. Okay, so now let's talk about some practical applications. I wrote these down as themes that I thought you could pick one and talk about. But before we get into a discussion, I was thinking about about how we think about how I think about practical applications, how I was brought up within my Western thinking and within my culture, within Christianity as I understand it. Um, Practical applications are frequently text-based and formulaic. The text says, I should do this. The text says, I should not do this. And so when I think about my applications, I can't seem to get, there's a barrier there beyond the do's and the don'ts. And I think what this book and what my understanding through studying this book and other things have taught me is that it's much more important, and we talked about this a little bit, that the narrative is important. The text is important. Reading the words and knowing what they say is extremely important. We seem to get that. But we've imposed this sort of legal framework where we try and understand the text and the spirit of the text. But what oftentimes we need to be doing when we're looking at the Bible is listening to the conversation that is being had between the divine and humanity. And what is the divine trying to communicate through the inspired text? What is the lesson that the divine is trying to deliver? The lesson of Esther is one of justice, equity, harmony. There were so many, and that's not to minimize the lessons of your life can matter as a single individual if you will step up. It's not to minimize the need for courage when the situation calls for it. But there are some bigger lessons, like the ones that we learned from the parallel passage in Genesis. Like, we need to get along with people we really don't like. We need to be willing to sacrifice. That's the story of Jesus, right? I'm going to sacrifice my life for people who have sinned against God, people who, for all intents and purposes, he shouldn't like. But love is greater than that. I mean, that's one of the lessons from Esther. So the point is, when we think about some of these lessons, it really has to do with how we understand who God is. If you understand that God is a hater of sin and ready to strike people down because of it, then you will hate sin and you will be ready to completely dismiss people because of it. If you understand God as someone who is full of compassion and loves to forgive, you will be someone who reflects that as well. What are the applications from what we've seen from the book of Esther as they relate to, and I've just put some up here, if you have others, that's fine, the fact that God doesn't seem present, and yet he was very present. The fact that there seems to be this juxtaposition of God's providence and rolling the dice. So many things, The king couldn't sleep. Is that a coincidence? The king had this particular passage of Mordecai uncovering this plot against him. Was that a coincidence? There's so many coincidences within the context of the book, and yet we know that God was involved. Hidden identity. What does it mean if we choose? What did it mean that Esther, for so long, was unwilling to say, "I'm Jewish"? And God used her. What happened to, I need to come forward with my Christianity and my convictions and my belief in God? Courage. There was the courage of Judah to let Benjamin go, or Jacob to let Benjamin go to Egypt. There was the courage of Judah to to go before to go before Joseph, there was the courage of Esther to go before the king, and then love, reconciliation, and sacrifice. I'm going to stop talking. We have about 10 or 15 minutes that we can. You tell me.
When you think about reconciliation, you're thinking between
Judah and Benjamin. Yeah, between those brothers who seem to not get along.
what they didn't get along.
It said that they hated Joseph so much
Oh, yeah.
they couldn't speak peaceably about him.
Oh, yeah.
And the end of Esther, it says that Mordecai was good to his people and spoke peace among them. It was a real juxtaposition.
I feel like this story is kind of like easier, I don't know. In a way, it's like relatable to life because you don't audibly hear God's voice all the time. But I feel like your hindsight, you can see where God was working out things. And that's a big part of that story. And then also like just how the Jewish people knew the text well enough to like with what Mordecai said to Esther, it like prompted her to move. It's like we need to know the Bible well enough that we feel those nudging when we need to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they were faced with a difficulty, they fasted and prayed. It's like, oh, that's a way that we can, So I feel like there's a lot of things in it where it applies to life in general.
Mm-hmm.
It's like big story, but everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sort of going along with that theme of sort of the Benjamites and the Judites and everything, which I thought was a really interesting piece of this. I mean, God is playing a long game, and a lot of times he is working things out through humanity and through lives and through families, and it's not going to unfold a lot of times to us when things are getting worked out. So, and our prayers, like, we are winging prayers really into, sort of like a very big thing going on, right? Yeah. So, and God is faithful, so, but we in our finite, short lives often do not see, what's at work.
Mm-hmm.
So what might have seemed incredibly hopeless and terrible and tragic at one point, which it was, but God was able to, to move through history, and create peace.
I was thinking for myself about how much Esther related to the courage it took both for Jacob to let Benjamin go to Egypt and for Judah to beg for the life of Benjamin in Egypt. And I know those stories, but I hadn't really thought about them from the perspective of what those people go through. It's kind of like they're so familiar to me that I know the ending, that I fail to relate. But what seems to be impressed upon Esther's heart was the courage that it took and the sacrifice that they made. And I don't mean to minimize what you said about knowing the word, but we do know the stories, and if we are willing to put ourselves in the shoes of those people, it and just let that just remember what other people did and why they did it, and the fact that we too, they were just like we are, just impressed upon me.
That one class, I like what you said about how God wants us to remember more than he wants us to look
Right.
ahead. There was a word for that.
Yeah. The word the word in Hebrew for tomorrow is the root word for looking back, and the word for yesterday is looking forward, and it implies that God doesn't want us to try and foresee the future. He wants us to back into the future, looking at the past, um, and because that's all we really know, right? And if we remember His faithfulness as we go forward, it goes a long way. If you could be a fly on the wall back in ancient Persia, which one of the scenes would you have liked to have seen from the book of Esther? What's that? Oh, Mordecai on the horse being paraded around by Haman. Yeah.
Is Brad allowed to answer?
Oh, yeah. Brad, you can answer. Go for it. Got a scene, a favorite scene?
Just kind of how Esther had, the multiple parties, just to put doubt in Cersei's mind about what was going on with
Mhm. Haman.
Haman.
Yeah. I'd like to be in the party with Vashti at the very beginning of the book. It said she had a party of her own, and she was in the middle of that party when she was asked to put on her crown and come parade before the king and his, and the governors. And I think that's so misunderstood that I would have liked to have really understood what was going on in that scene. So.